It happened without a siren, no emergency broadcast, no coordinated halt, just a sudden absence where abundance was assumed. A silence in the inventory, a hollowing out that moved faster than explanation. 15% of the world's silver did not migrate or rotate or rebalance. It vanished. In the span of a single day, the metal that has always been everywhere was suddenly nowhere that mattered. Markets call this volatility. Systems call it flow. History calls it something else entirely. Silver has never behaved like gold. It is too useful to be sacred and too abundant to be rare, which is precisely why it becomes the first place stress reveals itself. When systems are healthy, silver is background noise. When systems fracture, silver becomes a mirror. Not a mirror of price, but of trust. Not a reflection of demand, but of urgency. The disappearance did not register in the usual places. Prices moved, but not enough. Headlines flickered, but not for long. The explanation offered was procedural, technical, clerical. Inventory shifts, accounting delays, logistics. The kind of language designed to anesthetize attention. Yet none of it answered the only question that mattered. How does a metal mined, refined, tracked, and audited across the planet simply fail to be where it is promised to be? To understand why this was not normal, you have to understand how silver is supposed to function in a controlled economy. Paper claims circulate freely. Physical metal does not. The system works because most participants never ask for delivery. They accept exposure instead of possession, representation instead of substance. As long as belief holds, leverage can expand without consequence. This is not a flaw, it is a design. Every monetary era builds a story that allows it to stretch reality without tearing it. In empires past, the story was divine authority. In industrial ages, it was progress. In the modern financial state, the story is liquidity, that anything can be converted into anything else at any time without friction. Silver violates that story because it has mass, because it must be moved by hands and ships and machines, because it wears down, gets consumed, disappears into circuitry and medicine and energy systems that do not give it back. For decades, that consumption was ignored because price remained obedient. Low prices told a comforting lie. That supply was ample. That substitution was easy. That nothing fundamental was changing. But history shows that commodities do not warn with price. They warn with behavior. In the late stages of every monetary cycle, physical goods begin to slip out of view. Not all at once, not loudly. First through delays, then through reclassification, then through quiet exemptions that allow metal to be counted without being present. The paper structure grows taller as the foundation thins, and eventually the structure begins to consume its own support. What made this moment different was speed. 15% is not a rounding error. It is not arbitrage. It is not seasonal demand. It is a fracture line opening faster than the narrative can adjust. When that much metal disappears in a day, it signals that someone, somewhere, stopped accepting substitutes. This is how stress moves through complex systems, not through collapse, but through refusal. A refinery delays shipment. A vault tightens terms. An industrial buyer preemptively hoards. Each decision rational in isolation, catastrophic in aggregate. The public never sees the handoff points, the leases, the swaps, the rehypothecation chains that allow the same ounce to satisfy multiple obligations simultaneously. Those mechanisms are invisible until one participant asks a forbidden question. Show me the metal. When that question is asked at scale, the system does not answer. It stalls. History offers a pattern here. In the years before monetary resets, strategic materials become scarce without explanation. Copper disappears from warehouses. Grain reserves are redefined. Gold flows east while price remains calm. Silver, always the most sensitive, is the first to show the mismatch between promise and reality. This is not conspiracy. It is accounting under pressure. Authorities rely on the public misunderstanding of scale. They know that 15% sounds abstract, that a day feels arbitrary, that without context, the event dissolves into noise. But scale is everything. A system built on fractional backing cannot survive sudden claims on the fraction that actually exists. The reason this was not normal is not because silver vanished. It is because it vanished without permission. In stable systems, withdrawals are managed. They are spaced, rationed, negotiated. In unstable ones, they are abrupt. Someone breaks protocol. Someone prioritizes certainty over yield. Someone decides that paper is no longer adequate collateral for the future they see forming. The disappearance was a vote, cast not in markets but in logistics, not in price but in movement. Afterward, the familiar reassurances arrived. Inventories were adjusted, definitions were clarified, confidence was requested, yet none of these restored what was lost, because the metal did not return. It simply ceased to be available for promises that required it. This is how transitions begin, not with crashes but with constraints, not with panic, but with quiet competition for what still works without explanation. Silver does not vanish because it is precious. It vanishes because it is necessary. When an economy senses that trust is eroding, it reaches for the things that cannot be printed, extended, or deferred. The things that sit outside the language of policy. The things that do not care who believes in them. 15% gone in a day tells us that a segment of the system has moved ahead of consensus. That someone is no longer waiting for confirmation. That the phase change has begun, even if the surface remains calm. This was not a spike. It was a signal, not of shortage alone, but of intention. A declaration that in the hierarchy of claims, physical possession has quietly regained primacy. Silver has always played this role, the metal of the margin, the messenger that arrives before the announcement. When it leaves the stage this abruptly, it is because the next act is already being rehearsed elsewhere. The disappearance of silver was not a market event, but a behavioral one, because markets are merely surfaces and behavior is the depth beneath them. Prices can be managed, narratives can be shaped, and volatility can be explained away, but behavior reveals what participants actually believe when incentives and assurances begin to fail. When silver slipped out of availability, it did not do so with the theatrics of a crash or the spectacle of a spike. It withdrew quietly, almost politely, as if responding to a question that was never meant to be asked out loud. The question was simple and dangerous. Is the promise still as good as the thing itself? For decades, the modern financial system trained its participants to accept representations in place of reality. Claims replaced custody. Exposure replaced ownership. Efficiency replaced redundancy. This arrangement worked not because it was structurally sound, but because belief was widespread and synchronized. As long as everyone trusted that everyone else would not demand delivery at the same time, leverage could expand indefinitely. Silver circulated through contracts, certificates, futures, and inventories that were technically valid but physically thin. The system depended on the assumption that necessity would never outrun convenience. Behavior changes when that assumption weakens. Late-cycle stress does not behave like the textbooks predict. It does not arrive with universal panic or collapsing prices. Those are end-stage symptoms, not early signals. Stress first appears as hesitation. A counterparty asks for tighter terms. A warehouse delays confirmation. A buyer insists on shorter settlement windows. None of these actions violate the rules. In fact, each is rational, even conservative. But collectively, they begin to drain flexibility from a system that survives on elasticity. Silver sits at the center of this tension because it occupies a unique psychological position. It is not revered like gold, nor dismissed like base metals. It is treated as abundant until it is needed, and invisible until it is absent. Industrial users rely on it not as a store of value, but as a functional input that cannot be easily substituted without cost or delay. When those users sense instability, they do not speculate. They secure. They do not hedge. They remove risk by pulling material forward, holding more than models suggest, and refusing to release inventory back into circulation. This is where behavior overrides price. Price signals are slow and diluted in systems saturated with derivatives and financial overlays. Behavior, however, reacts to perceived fragility long before charts reflect it. A manufacturer who fears interruption does not wait for confirmation. A logistics firm sensing congestion does not wait for headlines. A sovereign buyer assessing geopolitical strain does not wait for consensus. Each decision is made in isolation, yet all point in the same direction, away from abstraction and toward control. Refusal becomes the dominant language. Refusal to roll contracts under the same conditions. Refusal to lend metal that may not be easily reclaimed. Refusal to accept delays that were previously tolerated. These refusals are rarely framed as alarms. They are expressed as policy updates, compliance reviews, or temporary adjustments. The language remains calm even as the underlying trust erodes. Delay follows refusal as a natural consequence. When fewer participants are willing to part with physical material, timelines stretch. Settlement windows widen. Inventory classifications become more creative. Metal that was once considered readily available is redefined as allocated, strategic, or reserved. None of these terms imply shortage, yet all of them restrict access. The system maintains the appearance of continuity while quietly rationing reality. Sudden withdrawals are the final behavioral marker before recognition sets in. Withdrawals are not acts of panic, they are acts of prioritization. When participants choose to remove silver from shared pools and place it under direct control, they are making a statement about future expectations. They are saying that optionality is more valuable than yield, that certainty outweighs efficiency, and that promises carry counterparty risk that is no longer negligible. This is how belief-based structures begin to hollow out. Not through rebellion, but through preference shifts. Not through chaos, but through accumulation and silence. Each withdrawal increases pressure on the remaining structure, forcing it to rely more heavily on confidence and less on substance. The more the system reassures, the more those already moving sense confirmation rather than comfort. What makes this process difficult to recognize is its moral neutrality. No rule is broken. No law is violated. Participants are simply acting in their own perceived best interest. Yet systems built on shared belief cannot survive widespread individual prioritization. Once enough actors decide that possession matters more than participation, the collective framework weakens regardless of official narratives. Silver's disappearance, therefore, was not an anomaly but a revelation. It exposed a shift already underway where the language of markets no longer aligned with the instincts of participants. The system did not fail in that moment. It signaled that it was being tested from within, quietly and methodically, by those who no longer accepted reassurance as a substitute for reality. In late-cycle environments, this is how transitions begin. Not with collapse, but with choices. Choices that favor tangibility over trust, immediacy over optimization, and certainty over consensus. Silver did not leave because it was scarce. It left because belief was. Silver functions as an early warning instrument of systemic transition because it exists at the intersection of trust, utility, and control. It is not held primarily as a symbol, nor is it consumed without consequence. It moves constantly between vaults, factories, and financial structures, making it uniquely sensitive to changes in behavior long before those changes are acknowledged in official narratives. When silver vanishes rapidly and quietly, it is not responding to price signals or speculative excitement. It is responding to a shift in perception that has already taken place beneath the surface, where participants are no longer aligned with the assumptions that once held the system together. Every complex system depends on shared expectations. Markets assume continuity, supply chains assume cooperation, financial leverage assumes availability. These assumptions do not fail all at once. They weaken asymmetrically, with certain actors recognizing the strain earlier than others. Silver is where those early recognitions tend to surface because it cannot be conjured, substituted easily, or delayed indefinitely without consequence. When it begins to disappear from circulation, it is because some participants have concluded that the future will not resemble the recent past closely enough to justify previous behaviors. This is what defines a phase change, not an event, but a reordering of priorities. In stable phases, yield dominates decision-making. Capital seeks return, inventory is minimized, and exposure is preferred to ownership. In transitional phases, control replaces yield as the primary objective. The desire to optimize gives way to the need to secure. Actors begin to accept lower returns, higher costs, and reduced flexibility in exchange for certainty. Silver responds immediately to this shift because it is one of the first assets to be pulled out of shared systems and placed under direct supervision. The quietness of its disappearance is the most important detail. Loud moves attract attention and resistance. Quiet moves indicate confidence and preparation. When silver leaves the system without explanation, it suggests that those withdrawing it do not need validation or consensus. They are not attempting to persuade others. They are positioning themselves ahead of recognition. This behavior is consistent across historical transitions, where early movers rarely announce their conclusions. They act, then allow events to catch up. Surface narratives lag behind these movements because they are designed to preserve continuity. Official explanations emphasize temporary disruptions, technical adjustments, or normal fluctuations. These explanations are not necessarily false, but they are incomplete. They describe mechanics while ignoring motive. The motive, in this case, is a reassessment of risk that cannot be articulated publicly without undermining the system itself. Leverage is where this reassessment becomes most visible. Modern financial structures rely on the assumption that underlying assets will always be available in sufficient quantity to satisfy claims, even if those claims multiply far beyond physical reality. This works only as long as most participants accept substitution and delay. The moment a meaningful segment insists on immediacy and possession, leverage is exposed not as efficiency, but as fragility. Silver exposes this fragility faster than other assets because its paper claims vastly exceed its accessible physical form, and because its industrial role makes withdrawal irreversible in many cases. Once silver enters production, it does not return to vaults in a usable state. This means that each act of hoarding or preemptive accumulation permanently reduces future availability. The system can absorb this behavior when it is marginal. It cannot when it becomes directional. The movement ahead of consensus is what makes these moments dangerous and transformative. Consensus is always backward-looking. It requires confirmation, repetition, and social proof. Early actors do not wait for these signals. They rely on pattern recognition, stress indicators, and a sense of timing developed through experience. When enough of these actors reach similar conclusions independently, their actions begin to reshape reality before the majority understands why. This creates a widening gap between appearance and function. Prices may remain calm. Official inventories may appear sufficient. Liquidity may seem intact. Yet access becomes more conditional. Timelines lengthen and terms tighten. The system continues to operate, but with increasing friction. Each added layer of reassurance masks a reduction in actual resilience. Silver's role in this process is not to cause transition, but to reveal it. It does not initiate stress, it responds to it. When it vanishes, it is because stress has already crossed a threshold where symbolic participation is no longer enough. The system is being tested not by ideology or speculation, but by necessity. What is exposed in these moments is not simply shortage, but dependency. Dependency on assumptions that were never meant to be examined too closely. Dependency on cooperation without guarantees. Dependency on the idea that everyone will continue to behave as they always have, even as conditions change. When that dependency is questioned, even quietly, the structure begins to adapt defensively. Silver leaving the system is one of the first defensive adaptations. It signals that some participants have concluded that the cost of being early is lower than the cost of being last. This is why silver's disappearance should be understood as a message rather than a mystery. It is the system communicating with itself through behavior rather than words. It is a signal that the phase has shifted, that leverage is being reevaluated, and that control has become more valuable than participation. By the time consensus forms around this realization, the metal will already be gone, and the transition will already be irreversible.